beta testing is, and like the testing experience is primed towards them telling us the stuff that was uncomfortable or they didn't like or that didn't work, right? Which is then kind of a bummer because as the game progresses, if they're having a really good time,
they just stop telling us things.
Butterscotch.
Hey everybody, welcome to episode 508 of Coffee with Butterscotch, the game dev comedy podcast of Butterscotch Shenanigans. I'm Seth and I'm the games programmer.
I'm Adam and I'm the analyzer of beta data.
I'm Sam, an artist.
And this is a show where we talk about life, business, and working in the games industry. Today's February 21st, 2020 vibes. Before we get started, we have a warning. There's going to be profanity in this show. We'd also like to thank our recurring supporters over at moneygrab.bscotch.net. Thank you so much for your monthly donations to help keep this podcast going.
Yeah.
Hell yeah! Speaking of profanity, I was
Fuck yeah!
I was a guest on 2 podcasts this week. One yesterday, one the day before. So this is my 3rd podcast in 3 days.
Wow.
Were you able to keep it in?
I was thinking, I wasn't sure because it's been so long since I've been in an environment where I had to think about whether or not I was going to be using profanity, you know. And I was like, am I even capable anymore of sort of pre-filtering as I'm talking to make sure that I don't speak the way I normally would, you know? And the answer is, the first guy was like, go to town, I don't care, you know? But I still like felt myself, because it's just another context. I was like, I should feel it. I shouldn't go fully to town, you know? And I felt myself successfully like choose when I was like, no, now it's sufficient. Like now I've reached the threshold where I can throw in a shit or something.
Mm-hmm. This is PG-13. You're getting your curses per minute.
Yeah, exactly. Like kind of, It was like
you get metering it out.
Yeah, in this podcast, I just speak the way I normally do. Which is,
you know what's so funny though is that because I remember we did one. I think we were for Levelhead or something, some guest podcast, and we warned them ahead to like we swear, and the guy thought that we were going to be swearing like all the time because we were very intense about being like just yeah, okay, like we actually don't. The rate is this actually a very low rate. You know what I mean? It's just that it's an occasional fuck gets thrown in, and that kind of it's the PG-13 versus R rating problem.
Yeah, it's not saturated, right? But it is more frequent than you're like. Average.
It's not very professional, you guys.
It's not
I'm going to be honest.
That's exactly right. Yeah,
it wouldn't fly in the workplace. Workplace.
Yeah, but the second podcast,
somewhere,
which because I watched, I watched a few from each person ahead of time to get a sense of what they were about, you know. And that one I was like, like it feels like it would probably be fine, but also like that's clearly not like the host never said a cuss word, you know. So I was like, okay, I'm gonna fully button it up this time around.
It's sort of like going.
It wasn't even
restaurant.
hard.
Yeah, it's like going to a restaurant when someone invites you out, right? It's like you don't look at the menu. You don't order first, and you don't order the most expensive thing, exactly. Right? It's like you see what they're ordering, and you like price match. You know what I mean? It's the same with swearing. If
they're paying, you know.
Yeah, if they're paying, if you're paying,
if you're paying, you get that. You get that meatloaf.
Yeah.
All right. What? I'm assuming meatloaf is the most expensive thing on the menu, right?
I mean,
I haven't been to a restaurant in quite a while.
If it has eggs in it, yeah.
If it's got eggs.
Yeah. If I went to a restaurant and the meatloaf was the most expensive thing on the menu, I'm getting that fucking meatloaf, you know?
That's true. It's probably delicious.
What is its deal? Because meatloaf is always good. But if there's kind of in my experience with meatloaf, the ceiling isn't that high. It's not high enough that I'd be like, yeah, it makes sense that this is the most expensive item on the menu.
Oh, so you'd be like, I'm intrigued.
Yeah, I got to try it.
I got to check out this $300 meatloaf. Yeah. I mean, back when I ate meat, I used to have a policy where any restaurant I went to, if they had meatloaf, I would buy it. And I never regretted it.
Yeah, it's always
banger.
Good. Yeah. It's just, I've never had meatloaf and been like.
It's the most unappetizingly named fucking amazing food that exists. It's just a loaf. But it's not just meat. It's like there's a bunch of stuff in it. That's what,
Yeah, if it's good. It's got all sorts of stuff.
It's not just I think like a steak is really a meatloaf. That's just like a block. It's just a chunk of meat.
That's true.
I'd call it
like a filet mignon.
I feel like it's a meat lump, you know?
Meat lump.
Because a meat loaf, it's about its buoyancy.
It's been shaped.
Yeah, it's shaped. It comes up into the air. It's
been forged into a loaf.
Yeah.
All right. Well, anyway, let's talk about what has been absolutely consuming our whole fucking lives this past week, which is the Crashlands 2 beta. Woo! It is underway. It's been going on since Tuesday morning, so we are now starting day 4.
Yeah, it started at 10 a.m. So we're basically 70 hours. We're 70 hours into it right now.
I've lived a whole lifetime.
Yeah. We're starting day 4.
Jesus.
it feels like it's been a fucking month. All right, so let's talk about how it's been going. So for starters, so we sent out something like 100 beta invites.
Just over.
And already in the first few days, we've hit 91% uptake. So that's good. You know, if you're one of those people who applied for the beta and took a spot from someone, and then you're like, I'm not going to play it though. You know, you gotta take a look at the mirror and think about that.
Yeah.
However, the beta runs for 2 weeks, and there's a weekend coming up. People are busy, so we didn't expect every single person, you know, to play it in the first.
Honestly, I'm
first
surprised
few days.
we had this high of a rate during the week.
Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. Yeah.
I was expecting honestly more like 50% kind of playtesting during the week, and then seeing a boost over the weekend. So I'm feeling great about it. And also. A significant fraction of the invites were for people who were like, oh, we know these people. We're not 100% sure if they're going to have time to test, but they'd give good feedback. So we're going to give them an invite anyway, you know? So I think we're going to end up, I was never expecting to hit 100%. I was expecting to hit 90%, but not until like basically by the end
or something.
You know?
Yeah. And there's been an interesting couple of snags that kind of make things a little bit hard to discern. The biggest one is that like on Steam, if you're testing on the beta, you've got to like put in a beta password to get onto the beta branch. Otherwise, you're stuck on like a super old version or on the demo or something.
It's basically it's a very technical fiddly thing that you got to do, that everybody has to do, right? And so that we know from everything we always do in the past that there's always an error rate with this, and even though we send out,
it's about 5%.
Yeah. And so it's very funny because we start getting these pieces of feedback from people. And we're like, can you show us your main menu? And it's literally from a year ago.
Yeah.
We're like,
So there's a handful of people who are playing a version of the game that was made, I think, like around or like just before the demo.
Yeah.
Like before the demo went out, I think. That doesn't have pretty much anything in it. It has like 3/4 less game in it compared to what we were currently testing. So getting those people kind of unstuck and then kind of like disentangling because we're taking a lot of telemetry, like we're recording a lot of data about where people are in the game and how long it's taking them to get there and what, you know, all that stuff. So trying to disentangle includes those people. Yeah. So trying to disentangle those people has been an interesting thing because, of course, it pollutes the data with weird stuff, right?
Yeah. And it is one of those things. It's just very funny anytime we do these where we're like, okay, the problem always, this is true for players, this is true for beta testers, this is true for anybody.
It's just people. Yeah.
It's just people. There are going to be people who will not fucking read the instructions. Yeah. They just will not. Yeah. And I want to describe for anybody who's not in the beta test what the instructions looked like, just so you have a sense. Because I know that people do not read instructions. So what I did when I sent out the email for Steam, I sent out a Steam specific email. And what you'll see sometimes with these things is like you'll just see like the Steam key in bold, huge front and center, and people be like, so that you can like make sure that people got their Steam key, you know. And I was like, no, I'm gonna hide this shit so that I make sure it's in the instructions. So the first thing that shows up,
them solve a puzzle to get their Steam key.
Make them solve a puzzle, right? So they have to read it. And so the first thing that pops up is with the warning emoji, you know, like do these things first. It's like make sure you're in the Discord so you can ask for help if you need it. And the second one is completely read the instructions because you need to make sure you're on the right Steam branch. Otherwise, you'll be on the wrong version of the game. It just says that right there with these, you know, neon flashing lights. And then the section below that is instructions. And then it says
with images,
with images that tell you how to do all the stuff. And the Steam key is given to you just like within the instructions it's not bolded, whatever, right? So like you would find it sort of by reading the instructions so that it was actually hard to find if you were just looking for your key. Because I fucking knew.
Which honestly, the error rate has actually been very low this time. Because every time we've done this,
I think because of that. Yeah. I mean, if we approach it where it's just like, here's your Steam key, it probably would have been a 50% error rate, right? Because as somebody excited to play a beta, you're going to see that Steam key and you're like, let's fucking go, right? And you just plug that in and you're done now, right? And so it's trying to get people on board into this. It's weirdly, it was like easier for mobile and stuff because you don't have like people just sign up for the test flight or whatever, and then you know you can get access.
They don't have to for like an hour. There was a paywall on the beta because we didn't realize there's like even if you're running a closed beta, these are all these like technical platform terms, right? A
Yeah,
closed
each
beta
platform is different.
on Google Play for a paid game still requires
Google will
testers
charge
to pay.
people.
So yeah.
Yeah,
It's
so
like,
the
oh,
Google
shit.
works is you have these various tracks, but so Steam, you basically just make them up. You just like, okay, here's a new branch,
Here's a branch.
and you can put a password on it or not, and that's it. And you decide what that means as the developer, right?
That branch could have anything on it. It could have TurboTax. You don't
It
know
could
what's
literally,
on that
it
branch.
could literally
Yeah.
be anything. And then on Google Play, you have these specific tracks that you could optionally like publish stuff onto, and then each one of those tracks behaves differently, right? So they have these two sort of, there's like an alpha track and a beta track, and those are public facing. What we didn't know is they are like the game as it is intended, right? So if the game is a paid game, so you got to pay for access to that track also, which we never use those tracks because there's also an internal track, which just is like the developer
Which
sort
we
of
use.
version, right? That's what we use. That's what we use the whole time. And because we're on the developer track, then even if we're added to the list of people who can be on like the alpha or beta tracks, if we then go like try to use them, then we're also in the internal track. So we bypass sort of
We
invisibly.
bypassed the paywall.
So we couldn't see.
basically.
We basically
So we couldn't, yeah, so
Because
we
we were
just, like, didn't
developers, we
realize.
couldn't test that. Yeah, so we got it disentangled. That was kind of a funny surprise where people are like, "So why do I gotta like pay you guys to get into this?"
I think my
beta?"
favorite
Like,
part was
oh
actually
yeah,
the-
don't do that. Don't do that.
My favorite part was actually the two people just did it. They're like, yeah, fuck, let's go.
I
Like,
think
I'm
it was
gonna buy
actually,
this game anyway. So
I think it was actually 5 by the time we
Was
fully
it?
turned it off.
We
yeah.
refunded all of them, of course, but it was just
yeah.
I was like, thanks.
Yeah, there was. Yeah, so there's always. It kind of reminds me of like whenever you're starting a video call with a family member, right? And
100%.
it's like the first 10 minutes is always tech support, right? And so like basically it's the same with the beta, except there's like 100 people in it, right? And so some number of people are gonna have some weird thing going on with their device or with
Being a
some,
platform
yeah, just something.
Yeah,
So
it went
kind of getting
remarkably smoothly, given
It
the
went
number of
pretty
people.
smooth.
And also, it was the selection of the testers was biased towards people who had multiple devices, so that they'd be testing not just on Steam but also on Google Play and or on iOS. And so they had to all be able to figure out all of the technical hurdles to get going, and we needed them to end up logged into the same Rumpus account across those devices.
Worked pretty good, honestly.
Which, like,
Very
for as many things that could have gone wrong, pretty fucking smooth sailing.
pretty good. Pretty good. Yeah. So then over the course of this, I guess 3 days at this point, we've got 5 people who are over 20 hours deep in the game.
Yeah, and that's
So
over
they're-
72 hours or whatever, right? So over
Yeah.
the course of 70 hours, they've
So these folks are putting like a third of their lives into Crashlands 2 since the beta started. It's like
presumably they're sleeping for the other.
yeah, it's like
so that's-
sleep, work, Crashlands 2. That's basically all. Those are the 3 8-hour chunks of the day. So that's been pretty cool to see that kind of like the game has enough hooks that if you're into it, then you just go and you just keep going. We've got our median playtime is about 3.5 hours because we got a number of people who kind of like started playing it and then, busy stuff, right? It's a Tuesday or a Wednesday. So they managed to get some playtime in and then, the weekend's coming and then they're going to bump that up. We got our average playtime is 6 hours. So our median is 3.5, average is 6. We got a healthy number of what we would call in the gaming community, no-lifers who are just going to town on this thing.
with every spare moment and eating into their sleep time as based on what they've told us,
Yeah. So that's pretty cool to see. We've got one person who is kind of like toward the tail end of Act 2 out of there's three major acts in the game. And we got about 6 people who have at least started Act 2. Most people are still in Act 1. And so this has been really interesting because we've played through the game a whole bunch of times, or I guess I have specifically. It takes a long time, right? So like my playthrough, it took me like 37 hours, I think, to nearly 100% the game, but with knowing everything, right? Like knowing where I'm barely reading quite. I'm testing for functionality and stuff. It's like I'm quickly skimming through the quest. Like I know what the characters are gonna say, right? And I'm kind of like jumping through stuff, and I know where to go. And
and I'm mostly at the very, very end, like leading right up into the boss fight. And I don't know everything about the game, even close to the way the set does, but I know a lot about the game, and it's taken me 50 hours to get to almost to the end.
But you
Yeah,
aren't
there's a lot of
it either, right? Because you haven't collected most of the
I'm
gems.
I'm 100% in quests,
Right, okay.
and the
Story
map,
content.
right? But not necessarily crafting every item and all that kind of stuff.
Got it.
Yeah. Yeah. And so everybody's kind of a different approach. And so, I'd say we'll see. I'm assuming that most people will take something like 60 hours to get through the game on a first playthrough.
50 or 60.
Yeah, like on a first blind playthrough. And then depending on if like how you're speed running, basically, I don't quite know what the minimum would be. You probably get through the whole game in something like 20 hours, maybe, if you like really found a good optimal path. But it's big. It's a big game. And so,
yeah, and the trick when you're making a big game, right? We've talked about this a lot. Is like you don't actually want to make a big game if you're not confident that the design can actually carry people all the way through, right? Because like tremendous,
if it runs out of
waste
steam in 6 hours, then you've added another 50 hours on top of that
for no reason.
Yeah.
So
you want the
Games
complaint
tend
to
turn
be
into a different game as they evolve, right? Because the loops
Kinda
change to keep things interesting. You have to make something less apparent, because I think this is where so many games, especially crafting games, kind of fall apart. I know for me, there's always like some point where I'm like, now this game is just inventory management because that's what it turned into. But once I had so much stuff, right? That's true for Valheim. It was true for what is that? V Rising. Yeah, it's like all these games where it's just like at some point
it goes from like being a wilderness survival sim to being like
Bag
an
manager.
office
Homestead
worker
management.
accounting sim.
Yeah,
You're just like, let me just take inventory. I've got my notepads. It's weird, that transition. We don't have that because we don't have inventory management in Crashlands 2. And actually, we have certain things that kind of now get easier. So for example, like we added loadouts last week, which is the ability to set up multiple gear sets and then just hot swap between them whenever you want. And so that means like as you get more stuff in the game just hands you ways to make that stuff not a problem and you don't have to do anything about it. So one of the things that's been kind of interesting about the beta, and this was kind of a worry that I have had, is that it's a engagement jump from the original Crashlands.
Yes.
Right. So original Crashlands is a one-touch game. You just tap on stuff. You don't decide what tool you're going to use. You just tap to go somewhere. You tap on a thing, and then stuff just happens automatically.
Yeah, and in combat, you do decide like in real time, am I going to use this sort of gadget to do an attack with it or whatever, right? But even then,
the targeting is all
targeting is automatic, and
it's just tapping a button more or less.
Yeah. And even like if you want to dodge an attack in original Crashlands, you just tap
Outside
away from
of
it
it, yeah.
and Flux runs out and then you tap back in and Flux. So it's all just one input, right?
And sure, you could play the whole game with a mouse. Just a mouse.
yeah,
Right.
Yep.
Yeah.
And so that means that on the one hand, you just pick it up and it doesn't really matter what your level of gaming experience is. You can go, right? On the other hand, it means that the depth of types of interactions and how dynamic combat can be and stuff like that is pretty constrained compared to an alternative, right? If every time you're fighting stuff, it's like a one target thing, and it's always tap to move and everything you can do gets collapsed into one button, then
There's not a lot of depth we can put in there. Yeah.
And you feel that in the original Crashlands where like as you get into Act 2 and deeper into Act 2 and then into Act 3, the loops of the game start to kind of become more apparent, right? Where you're like, time to move to the next workstation, time to move to the next thing. And so in Crashlands 2, we flattened it out a lot more. It's a lot more open and it does ask more of the player. Yeah. So for example, like you can just run out of attacks in Crashlands 2, but you also have this juke ability that has a cooldown and has charges and stuff. So like you can juke like 3 times back to back, and each juke charge has its own regenerating cooldown, kind of thing. And so that's just an extra layer of stuff you can do. And then like you have to aim. You don't just tap on stuff. You aim in the direction and capture the enemy in your telegraph and stuff like that. So then the worry is like, is that too much? Is that too much to ask of people compared to the original game? And is that going to kind of kick people out? And so we do have multiple game modes, which we've talked about in the podcast, where we have like chill mode, adventure mode, and challenge mode. where we've made fundamental changes to things like attack timings and stuff. So like on chill mode, enemies just attack much slower. They pause more between attacks. They give you a lot of time
More
to fight
windows
them.
of opportunity, basically.
Yeah, windows of opportunity, and you have more health. So even if you do take a stray hit, you can absorb it very easily and stuff like that, right? And then on the flip side, on challenge mode, the game's a lot faster. It's like 30% faster than baseline. You have less health. Like taking stray hits is pretty deadly, and it's much easier to get hit by stuff. And so you've got to really, in challenge mode, you got to really think hard about like what equipment you're using and how you're approaching fights, and kind of like min-max your gear and try to find like ways to deal big damage, all kinds of stuff. Chill mode, you can almost play like the original Crashlands.
Yeah.
Where you can just kind of do whatever, and you'll see a satisfying level of success in combat and as you progress through the stories and stuff like that. And so one of the difficulties for me is that I've been kind of grappling with during the beta as a developer is like, as a min-max kind of more hardcore player, I know all these cool things in the game, all these gadgets and all these cool combos you can do and cool ways you can build out your character and blah, blah, blah. And that's how I like to play. And whenever I think about people playing the game, that's how I envision them playing the game, because it has all those things in it, right? And then seeing there's going to be a subset of people in when we launch the game, but also in the beta, who they're like, I'm just vibing. I don't give a fuck, right? So
well, honestly, the average player is going to be closer to that, right? Than the max player.
Yeah. And so people who are playing on chill mode, they don't need to do any of that stuff. They can, whatever weapon they've got, they can just use. They don't need to put in combos of gear. They don't have to craft every item and try to figure out which ones combine the best. They can just, whatever they've got laying around, they can just use it. And a few of those people are the people who are like 20 hours deep.
Yep.
Right. And so
it's just looking at there, because we have our telemetry lets us see what people's hotbar loadout is. Basically, what are you bringing into combat with you? And Seth's just over here cackling because he's like, they still have essentially
somebody like picks up a thistle at like the first minute of the game, and then 20 hours later, they've still got that thing on their hotbar, and they're not using it in combat. It's just there, right? And they may have even found or picked up some other gadgets that do like really big damage and stuff, but they don't care.
Yep.
They just stab stuff with their dagger, and they're having a good time. And they're progressing through the game, and they're just really enjoying it, right? And then like if they want to do a second playthrough at a higher difficulty or something, then at that point they might be forced to kind of like think a little bit more about what's going on with their equipment and stuff. But it's very but my personal struggle has been like being okay with people having fun in a way that is incomprehensible to me, where it's like, that's what we built the game for. It's supposed to have this wide range of levels of engagement.
Yeah. And also just style, right? It's like I think one of the most fun sort of responses I've seen so far has actually been kind of from inside the house, which is that our artist who Anne, who'd worked with us on for the last year, basically fleshing out tons of stuff in the game. She only played it for a little bit, like when we first onboarded her, and then she very purposely was like, I'm not gonna play it so that I can actually experience it.
Yeah, so she had like a custom world VR in-game editor for dev stuff, right? So she
tested art assets,
there, and then and that was it.
Yeah, and so she and her partner have been playing through it, and I've just been getting then kind of feedback from her, and it's very funny because her partner plays much more on like the action RPGs, so basically closer to the house that's would play, right? So he's playing on challenge mode. He's much more.
Like, how do I do the most damage? How do I just crush my enemies? Yeah,
it's like if you ask the question like, what's that person's favorite game, right? It's going to be something again more on the action, more on the challenge and mastery side of the play style equation.
Elden Ring,
exactly that sort of shit, right?
High level WoW,
some crunchy stuff, and then Anne on the other hand is much more of a the cozy game vibe. You're here for the story, narrative completionist sort of thing. And lo and behold, we got this funny note, from her. She was like, it's like 4 a.m. and we're still playing. And then like the next day, I got a bunch of snacks. We're still playing. And so you have two very divergent play styles, right? That are able to be still served by the same base design. And we talked actually, if you kind of scrub back through the 3 bajillion episodes that are available about Crashlands 2, on the podcast, a lot of the stuff we talked about was this depth of engagement question. So whether or not you as a player have to cognitively like really engage with every single system in a way that is tight, where it's like you have to meet it exactly where it is, or if you can kind of bucket your interests enough where you don't have to care so much about like what's on your hotbar, because I don't care about that. I'm just like, I'm here to vibe. Or you can if you want, but also like not pay attention to, I don't know, farming or some other aspect of the game, right? Can the game support that? And that was a big thing we were trying to do alongside then that base level change in controls and all that, with the goal being that kind of no matter who you are, you can pick it up, and no matter what kind of gamer you are, you can pick it up and really, really enjoy it, right? By tuning some of these variables. And it does seem like we've hit that, which is, to me, that's really exciting, because the first one essentially like suffered on the top end of that, where it's like you couldn't, people who
it had a lower skill. I would say it had a high skill floor and a not much different skill ceiling. So skill floor and skill ceiling is just like what kinds of results you can get from the game based on your level of skill, right? So high skill floor means if you barely know what's going on, you're still going to get good results, right? High skill ceiling means as your skill goes up, your results go up a lot, right? And so there wasn't that wide of a band in original Crashlands. Crashlands 2 does have a pretty wide band of just how crazy of stuff you can do if you're really like engaging with all of the game systems.
There's a lot there to think about if you want to, but it's wild to me that if you don't care, you could just go and have a good time.
I feel like the optimal, because my playthrough was on chill mode. I honestly, like, I tried, and also it was the earlier version. I started it when our controls on mobile and on Steam Deck were a little harder to use, and so I was like really struggling when I was on those devices to do any combat at all. Yeah, but also that's not what I was there for. I was there for kind of the rest. I was there for the incidental combat, you know. Like I wanted that to be fun since you have to do it a lot, but I didn't want it to be that hard, you know. So I was like straight up chill mode. I technically had stuff in my hotbar, like I put stuff in there when I got it, you know. But it was just whatever I had, and then I just never fucking used it, right? Like very early game, you get that spacewalk that you can use to stun enemies, right? Not really a spoiler because it's in the demo and it's literally the first 10 minutes.
It's like we had the space wrench in the first game. It's like the first item you get is something you can use to stun enemies, right? So basically the same thing in Crashlands 2.
Yep, and I think I used it like twice, and it was kind of hard for me to like do it because I just wasn't very good at it. And I was like, oh, I'm just going to stab stuff. And then that's all I did. That's
the thing. On chill mode, like the reason you stun enemies is to buy yourself time to attack them.
Yep.
On chill mode, the game has given you that time baseline.
Yeah. You don't have to
always, right? So you don't need to worry about stunning enemies. So you can kind of do whatever.
Just go kind of fight stuff and not really worry, just not think about it that hard.
And I think we even lengthened the stun on chill mode. So your stun lasts for like 50% longer.
Yeah,
so
if you do bother to try to use it, then it's more
effective. You got infinite time to just go to town, you know?
And it's interesting noting then the difference between like this and Levelhead, which is any precision platformer experience is they're very tightly designed, right? Where like you can't, as a player, you don't really have a way to not engage with some portion of it in exactly the way that it is requesting of you, right? Because it's like you either make the jump or you don't. You either make the timing or you don't, right? It's not
precision platformers are binary. There's we did add a time scale thing where you can like put the game in slightly slowed down mode.
Yes. But that still doesn't quite
it's still hard.
Because you can't do this thing where you're like, literally, I'm just not going to jump.
Yeah, it doesn't change the vibe of the game, right? It just changes just a little how difficult it is.
So I've been really happy with how that's panned out. I think that's been just a nice thing to see that the game can support that kind of engagement because we put so much thought into that. And I think the other thing then is that looking at some of the stuff that I recall being like problems from the demo or stuff that we really wanted to tune up after some playtest, which largely were like just generally making sure harvesting was really satisfying.
Yeah.
And then generally...
Because it was a pretty common complaint for the demo and from the alpha that like stuff was like a little grindy, which was like, that was the thing we were like,
oh God,
really trying to avoid because that was the complaint in Crashlands 1 as the game progressed, you know, that it just started
to
feel grindy.
Have gotten that not at all.
Yeah, I haven't even seen it now. I haven't even seen it once.
I've seen it once, and I cannot describe to you how pleased I am with that because it's like that's so fucking hard in a crafting game. Yeah. That is so hard to do to make it so people slapping trees are not upset about slapping
They're just psyched about it.
Yeah. So big kudos to the team for. I mean, we did a lot of thinking about how exactly to do that to make that work.
Well, like we talked about last week too, about how like just adding that little cast bar under the player,
Yep.
Yeah.
it just gives this feedback where like you know how fast your swing is going, and even if your character's obscured behind a tree because it's an isometric game and you might be chopping it from the other side, right? That cast bar is drawn on top of everything, so you can still see your swing timer.
Yep.
And even like just little things like that just make it so that there's enough visual feedback and clarity of what's happening that it just becomes it goes from confusing and frustrating to very satisfying and obvious.
Yeah, no, honestly, it's a huge win. Like I would challenge someone after playing Crashlands to play another crafting game where the harvesting remains just an enjoyable thing to do on your 20th hour. Like genuinely, I just don't know another game that's done it. So that's a big feather in the cap.
I think Terraria to me is the one that's like the closest in the sense of like it isn't in a different way, which is that you're just harvesting completely different stuff with increasingly absurd like
tools,
power and tools, right? So that they just keep making
growth
it interesting,
avenue there,
culminating in the fucking UFO, which is just the most fun thing in the universe.
Yeah, that's true.
Which is just like laser blasting through everything.
But I think what's interesting theirs is power progression based.
Yeah.
But ours is not. Or like it kind of is, but not really, where it's like it's much softer. It's not like you don't get a car with lasers attached to it that you just drive around and plow through stuff, right?
Yeah.
But like the fundamental interaction between the player and like how they get resources from stuff has enough base interest, which we talked about a lot when we were trying to figure out how exactly to conceive of this, like mechanically conceive of Crashlands 2 early on, was how to make it so that somehow positioning yourself is like the minigame that you're playing when you're harvesting stuff, and how to make that interesting all the time.
Yeah.
Which is also the
Right.
minigame you're playing in combat, right? Because like fundamentally,
it's exactly the same.
yeah, fundamentally the game is about timing and positioning.
Mhm.
And bringing that into harvesting when your enemy is a tree that doesn't move, right? Was challenging, but it feels like we did. And you're like fundamentally you go from what? Like if your shittiest tool, right, at the very beginning of the game, going up against like the, tier appropriate stuff, a tree is what 3 hits, 5 hits, something like that.
Mm-hmm.
And then the lowest it can go down to is 1, right? So, and the highest tier tool, if you come back and hit that same tree, it's like fun because you just blasted in 1 hit, sure, right? But fundamentally, that difference is not that big, right?
No, it's not that big. It's like we're not doing it through power creep, right?
Yeah.
And I think that's what's interesting to me about that. Mechanically, it's just got a lot more interest. So that's been great. And then another big one was the fishing game. We've had so many troubles with the fishing game. First was like sort of questions of the economics of it, some stuff we had to do there from the alpha and the demo. And then secondly was just like a big revisit, which we talked about last week about bringing it more in line with how the original one functioned. And again, trying to get it to a point where it's similar to the harvesting. It's like, it's the same. It basically, they're all shades of the same game. It's either timing
again, right?
Timing and positioning every single time. And that, I mean, Seth overhauled that, like Monday of last week or something.
Yeah.
And universally, everyone's like, it was dope. I love it. I've just been fishing.
Yeah.
It was initially
Because
too
I'm like,
hard,
oh, thank
probably, but that was the only complaint. Otherwise, everybody was having a great time with it.
Well, the Whopper game has been a little bit of a challenge.
Yeah.
Because we have the 2 different modes of fishing. One is where you catch a Whopper, which is a huge fish that you got to like wrestle with, And that one I think we overshot the difficulty of. But we're tuning it, and again, kind of like we talk about the chilled stuff. It's just like a couple of little.
It's just some
numbers.
tuning.
Like it's just a couple of little tweaks here and there, like just make this thing 3% slower and this thing 5% bigger, and then now it's fine. So yeah, we'll be kind of working on that, but.
But
I think it's hitting a good spot.
It's mainly just that like the some of those core things that are like mechanically at the base of the whole game that had a bit of it's not jank, it's like a bit of a problem before. It really feels like from this beta what we're seeing is that those are not problems. They've been transformed onto the other side, which people love them, and I'm like, yes.
Well, we found the balance. So this is something that when I went to the Global Game Jam and I was talking with some new jammers, and they were asking for some tips, and I was like, balance, focus on balance. It's easy as a developer to get really psyched about mechanics and like, oh, this is cool, this interaction is cool, and this does this. At the end of the day, fun comes from balance, and that's just and so that, like the example would be, you've got a sword. and you're fighting an enemy, and if your sword one-shots the enemy, is that fun? But it can be in some contexts.
Yep.
Depends on the game, right? But it also means that as a player, you're not having to, there's nowhere to go from there. There's no growth from there. And also there's not really much of a challenge in fighting that enemy, right? Mm-hmm. If your sword takes 300 hits to kill that enemy, it might be too many.
I've seen it's almost universally not fun.
Yeah. It might be a lot, right?
But you might want that because you might want to tell the player, I don't want you to do this. So you do it.
Come back here
preventing
later.
them from doing it, you make it seem pointless so that they got to do something else.
Mm-hmm.
And then, if it takes like 7 or 8 hits to kill the enemy, again, depending on how fast the swings are, what the combat is like, that might be perfect. That might be the sweet spot, right? It also might be way too many or way too few, and then it sucks again. But it's all going to depend on all these other balance levers. How fast is the enemy attacking you? How many enemies are you facing at a time? How hard is it for you to dodge enemy attacks? So that like, is it too intense to get your hits in? But all these things they're not mechanics changes. These are just numbers.
Yeah.
This is just how long does this take? How much HP how much damage does this do?
Yeah.
And the fun of the game just comes from fiddling with those numbers.
Well, we talked about too how the animation impacts the balance as well, right? Which is again, that's not a mechanic. It's not a thing it's not a thing the player does, right? It's a thing that impacts how the player perceives what they're doing and how much effort is required and how long it's taking, all that kind of stuff. And all of that stuff has such a huge impact that you can also and need to also think about features and feature changes and like things that you could do, right? But to Seth's point, you can do a fuckload just by tweaking numbers up and down, right?
Yeah. And then I think, and importantly, until you're at a point where you're like, we've tweaked these numbers. We've maxed the fun of this
optimize
thing.
The numbers. Yep.
That's the point where you could find this. Like, again, going back to the fishing game, the problem was not actually balance one. In that case, we got in the balance, we pushed the balance as far as we could go with how that previous game worked, and it still wasn't working, right? And then it's like, okay, now we need to add some more. We need to revisit this, add some complexity. Yeah, that's mechanics again.
Yeah, it turns out that some mechanics aren't that fun. And you can maximize the balance of them, and it's like in the case of the fishing game like we talked about last week, it was just you would just wait, like you just wait and you click and you wait and you click and you wait and you click, and you're not deciding anything or whatever. So we hit a local maxima, and it's time to do something new. Yep. But it's also the case like there's going to be somebody who finds what the previous fishing game was. There's going to be somebody who enjoyed that. Yeah. Who was like, 100%. I like this. Yeah,
I like balance is personal.
Yes. And in the context of the game, like, there's certain things that make more sense to be simpler or more sense to be more complex, right? Depending on what you're trying to do. But I do think that just like the changes to some of the fundamental things that have been what I would describe as like they've been very large gains on the player experience side, resulting from some it's not like we're adding huge systems or features, right, to try to get those experiential gains. It's this like it's more of these smaller refinements and stuff that we've been able to successfully do, and those are the most exciting because again I talked a lot about like pre-alpha, what I was worried about, pre-demo, what I was worried about, pre-beta, I was worried about, which is like, does this thing work? Does the whole thing work? Or are you missing some giant ass system? Did you just like misalign the whole thing?
Or did you do too much?
Or did you do too much?
Is there too much shit going on?
Yeah. And like, I think we're at a point where it's like, it really feels like all the stuff we have in there is what should be in there. And it's rough, like pretty nicely tuned, to make it all go. So we're doing tons of stuff, and we've already put out basically putting out a patch a day. Pouring through all the player feedback has been intense, to say the least. It's like, our QA team are basically every morning, Seth and I or kind of basically the whole day actually sit down and kind of go through these line items that the QA team's pulled out of all these kind of journals that the beta testers are taking, and then make decisions about everything, and then be kind of exhausted and try to implement some of it, kick out a build, and that's been the last couple of days.
Yeah, and the interesting thing about this beta compared to the original Crashlands beta. So original Crashlands beta, the game was simple enough and I think refined enough by the time we entered the beta that the stuff that we ran into from players was just bugs. Just thousands of bugs.
I don't think we could get to actual design refinement because there's so many
we were just fixing bugs, which is also why, like, after the launch, And after several more weeks of bug fixes after the launch, then we got into our like quality of life patch, where we finally got to address some of the non-bug issues that the game was facing. And so this time around, the bugs are they're not really that many.
There's almost no bugs, which is insane. There's very few bugs.
Or the ones that there are, they're kind of like such specifically weird edge. Like I think like one just popped up last night where it was like, if you exit build mode while moving, while picking up something, then
they're real specific.
Then something weird happens. Not in like a game crashing way, but it's like you get stuck and then you got to like go back to the main menu and come back in or something like that.
And we've
just something very weird.
We've even had fairly few cases where people came at like quest related things in unexpected ways, right? Because that's absolutely one of the biggest challenges of the whole thing is making sure that, oh shit, what if somebody like comes to this later and they hack through this thing that when they were supposed to come here, they weren't able to come through that route, but now they can. Does stuff still trigger properly? Like trying to make sure we covered all those bases was just so hard. And that's probably the most common like sort of category of issue we're having, but still not very common, is like somebody got at something a little sideways. But to me, the most fun ones are the ones where more than one person did a very weird thing, right? So in the beginning, which is in the demo, so it's not a surprise, right? In the beginning, you find Juicebox in this little grove, right, where he's been flung out of the spaceship upon crashing.
First 30 seconds spoiler, by the way.
Yeah, first 30 seconds spoiler. And to get him out of there, you got to get your first tool so you can like hack your way through, right? Except two people thought they had to trick a slugabun into coming into that area and chewing its way into that space so that you could get to Juicebox that way, which we did not prepare for. So like if you did that, the Juicebox just hangs out.
In no universe would we have thought that people would think to do that. Because this is so strange.
Two people did.
Yeah, but the strange thing is like that's a complex interaction, right? Like that's watching what the creatures are doing, noticing that they are chewing on the type of tree that is the same thing that's trapping Juicebox, and then being like, can I lead this creature to it, right? And this is like you've been playing the game for like a minute at this point, and then to be looking around the world. Like we're always worried about overwhelming the player with like trying to tell them too much about how things work.
Yeah,
right?
this is fun. That's true.
And then every now and then you get somebody coming in who's very tuned into how things work, and then
I see what's going on here.
They just do wild shit out of the gate, and we're just like, "What on earth made you think that was what we wanted you to do?" But it didn't break anything. It was a little weird.
It was just weird, because then Juicebox just hangs out and doesn't say anything until you go do what you're actually supposed to do, right?
Yeah. Because we didn't plan for that. Whoops.
Well, I think that's one of the interesting things is like for the beginning of the game, we still like even these really weird things, like we still want to mitigate those ones, even if they're really rare, because we want the beginning of the game to do a really good job of like making sure the player figures out what we're intending and like what the intended feel of the game is, so that when they hit something like that, if they try that weird approach and then it doesn't work, they're like, okay, the developers wouldn't mean for me to do this kind of thing. Maybe I should go read the instructions, right? Maybe I should go read the quest. And make sure that players have the opportunity at the very beginning of the game when they're most likely to do weird shit because they don't know how to reason.
They don't know what they're supposed to do or how the game works.
And they don't know how to reason about like the design intent, right? Yeah, because we could have meant that, like we didn't, right? But we could have meant, this is the way you interact with the world is by like tricking animals into doing really slow stuff until you get what you want, right? Like that could have been a thing we decided. There are games like that, right?
This is a game about shepherding wildlife and having them just do things while you observe.
But then once the game unfolds, then it's just less worrisome because then players know if they do something that they can tell that it seemed weird that they did it that way. And then if they get a weird outcome, they'll blame themselves and not us, right? And so a lot of this is trying to figure out like where do we draw the line between it's acceptable that people just do that, we don't need to protect against it, whether it's because that part of the game or it's because it's so unlikely that somebody would do it. But in all cases, we still have to make sure that the game doesn't just break because it still has to fundamentally work no matter how weird people get. And so far, that's been going pretty well.
Yeah, and that's been kind of the other interesting angle of the beta is that we have a vision of what the path is that people will move through the game. We know all the game systems, we know all the items, we know all the characters, we know all the quests, and we can't unknow those things. And so when we have 100 people coming into the game, most of them coming in for the first time, this has been incredibly useful for us to find those things that are just not clear, right? Or even things that we've made clear, but then in a context in which the player wasn't able to receive it, right? Because like if you explain something to somebody, but then it's like if it's like in a long time gap between when they actually need to use it, they just won't remember at all, right? And so making that information available in a way that in a place that they will think to check so that they can refresh their memory of how that thing works. That's something that like we've done quite a lot of this week is like shoring up some of the UIs to have extra information in them once the player gets to that point so that if they forgot, then they can easily get back on track, you know?
Yeah, it's mainly been changes for the sake of clarity. I think it's kind of across clarity or just like general UX stuff where it's like things are just less clunky or, you know, you could tell what's going on basically. Yeah.
I think there's also, that's one of those interesting ones too from a business and making game standpoint, which is, you know, you don't need everything to be crystal clear all the time as long as players can figure it out, you know? And so trying to decide exactly like, oh, these players were a little confused, but they eventually figured it out. So do we need to do something, right? But one of the categories of like, do we have to do something that you have to consider is if the game launches and is really successful and there are lots of players, how many support tickets are we going to get, right? And so if the thing is like fundamentally figure outable and everybody seems like, but a lot of people seem to get confused for a while first. And some of those people like really struggle to figure it out, but eventually do. Then that's one of those things where you're like, we're going to get support tickets about that thing, right? Which is then time that we have to spend dealing with it. So part of our strategy of trying to decide like, okay, do we do something here is just to always consider like, okay, yeah, it's actually fine. Like people figure it out, but how much time is it going to take away from us as they're in the process of figuring that out? And so sometimes we have to but make it's also things clearer even when we otherwise think it doesn't matter because we're trying to save ourselves that future headache.
Yeah. And there's also things that I don't think would generate support tickets necessarily, but it's like things that players can just ask other players about, right? Or that they would like look at a guide for, which means it still has to be clear enough that the player understands how to articulate what the problem is that they're seeing.
Yes. Yeah.
Right. So if somebody is on a certain quest or something and then they can't figure out what to do.
If they could Google, how do I do blah on quest blah, right?
Exactly.
Then it's fine.
It's probably fine.
Then it's fine, you know, and also like there's some quests and there's some things where we deliberately kind of like, you know, throw something out there into the ether and then like just make the player kind of figure it out. Like but those kinds of things are, you don't want to do too aggressively at the very beginning of the game because people don't have the tools to figure things out. And so a lot of what's going on in the beta then is us trying to find that line of which things are okay for people to be a little bit kind of not stuck on, but kind of like having to put some mental effort into figuring out.
Because being confused isn't bad in a game context. Being disengaged,
it's guaranteed.
Yeah, it's guaranteed, right? Because you're learning.
Being confused and stuck.
Yeah, it's being stuck is the bad thing, which comes from either a player just not being sufficiently curious and actually trying, or them just not being equipped with the tools yet, either because the game they haven't engaged with the game enough to like understand what the problem solving looks like inside the game, or in combination with players have different game language because of the games they've already played before, right? And so things that we think are really obvious to try to do they're not going to be for like a person new to games or a person who only plays mobile games or, you know, whatever, a different kind of categories of gameplay experiences. And so but you also don't want to make a game that's like, okay, we're going to make sure that this works for like a person who's only ever played mobile puzzle games, you know, like,
too narrow.
It's too narrow. And so we need to like, I guess it's always finding that line of where we think it's going to be good. Yeah.
And the interesting thing is kind of how that feedback changes. So in the beta, like we anticipate that this is going to happen is at the very beginning, people are confused about everything, right? So they will always comment on the fact that they're confused about it. They'll be like, yeah, this character told me to do this and I didn't know what that meant. I figured it out immediately, but I didn't know, right? And they'll tell you, like, they'll tell us that.
We tell them to tell us that, right?
Yeah, and we're like, okay, because as long as there's still that discomfort of like the game put something onto my plate that I couldn't handle immediately, right? And I had to do a little bit of, it was kind of uncomfortable as I had to kind of think through what I had to do or whatever. And then I figured it out and that was cool. Right.
Well, yeah, and them describing it, because like if somebody describes having been frustrated or confused or whatever, they're not even necessarily describing that as a problem that they think we should solve. They're not necessarily reporting it, right? They're just describing their experience. And so, but because it's negative, then the sense is that that is a problem. And it feels like they've reported a problem.
Well, I think
it feels
what it
like
is
we have to solve it. Right?
It's recognizing that it's actually not negative. It's inherent, right? It's inherent in a video game.
It's just part of learning. It's the uncomfortability of not knowing things.
Yeah,
you
always get hit by stuff where you're like, what? And then I think in a game that has more systems in it, like Crashlands does, like the length of time before which you feel like you kind of like know how everything works in this game. I think it takes a really long time because there's just a lot of parts, right? Where you can get like some completely like new, like technically new thing can happen, and enough stuff around it that it's able to like easily just slot into your world knowledge, right? It's not a surprise in like a learning way.
Yeah. So what you see then is for people who are in the first half of Act 1, they've got a lot of feedback, and it's coming hard and fast because they're getting hit by all kinds of new things, right? And like one example in particular, which I thought was kind of funny, is there's one person who had been giving tons of feedback all through Act 1, and then we kind of didn't hear from them for a while. And then we find out that they're 2/3 of the way through Act 2.
Mm-hmm.
Yep. And they just kind of got into they got it all figured out, and they figured out how things work. And they were getting past all those uncomfortable, like, I wasn't sure what to do here or, whatever. And they're just cruising. And that's kind of what we're expecting kind of like after like this weekend. A lot of people who haven't had the time to play are going to be really going ham on Act 1. Mm-hmm. So we're going to be getting a lot of the same kind of feedback about those types of things. But as all these people get deeper into the game,
it just disappears.
The feedback plummets, which is is good for us because, oh man, it's a lot. It's a lot to parse and process.
Yeah. So basically at that point, the feedback and the kind of feedback you get changes, right? Because the feedback at the beginning is just the experiential, like, this is what it's like for me to play this game, right? Everything I'm confronting is new. I don't know how to think about it. So like, this is just what it's like to play this game, big picture, right? Yeah. And like you're saying, as people learn how to play the game, they're not going to tell us what that's like anymore. They already did that. They already told us.
They tell you what it's like to master it.
Exactly.
If you get through.
So now what you start getting is the more sporadic things that are going to happen, like when like new mechanics are introduced, we might hear something about that. But mostly we're at that point going to be hearing about like bugs or particularly exciting things. Like that's kind of what's left after people describe what the whole ass game feels like, right? And so I think it'll be interesting to watch this all taper off and the kind of stuff that we get. I am beta testing and like the testing experience is primed towards them telling us the stuff that was uncomfortable or they didn't like or that didn't work, right? Which is then kind of a bummer because as the game progresses, if they're having a really good time, if nothing bad happens, they just don't fucking hear anything, good or bad. So it's weird.
But overall though, all of our concerns about the game are gone. I think it's hitting a wide range of play styles. People are really getting into it. People are sinking dozens of hours into it, even in just a few days. So it's been, despite the fact that almost everything that, comes from the beta test is negative stuff that we have to fix. I mean, that's why we're doing it. And looking at the analytics and the data and then seeing the positive comments from people has been very reassuring that like, okay, every game's going to have some rough edges and some jank. The purpose of the beta is to find those things and smooth them out for the launch. But even if we didn't, I would say it's in a very good state that if we launched it, next week, or something, we wouldn't be in trouble. No. We don't want to because there's so many things we want to still improve. Like we want to get it from like really good to insanely good. That's kind of the jump we want to make now between now and launch. So I guess we probably got to wrap up because we got to get back. There's a lot going on. So that's all the time we have for this week's episode. We'd like to thank our producers Fat Bard and Sampa DaCosta for putting the podcast together, and thanks to our community moderators who keep our Discord running. To get more involved in the Butterscotch community, just go to podcast.bscotch.net, where we have links to the Discord, a way for you to donate to support the podcast, and links to the archives for all the episodes. And if you haven't yet, head on over to Steam and give Crashlands 2 a wish list. Go to the App Store and pre-order, and head over to Google Play and pre-register.
And you can find all those links at crashlands2.com.
Crashlands2.com.
Yeah.
And just click on all those links and do all the things, and that'll help boost the game up on the charts and have it help us have a successful launch. We'd appreciate it. So thank you all for listening. We'll see you next week.
Goodbye.